Hello, everyone. Welcome on this rainy day. Hopefully, you will be rewarded by, first of all, sitting in this extraordinary space, and also the conversation that I hope we get to have here. My name is Gal Beckerman. I'm the books editor at The Atlantic, and I have the pleasure today of talking to Geraldine Brooks and Jabari Asim. I'll give you their bios. Geraldine is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel March and the international bestsellers The Secret Chord, Caleb's Crossing, People of the Book, and Year of Wonders, which is also being optioned recently by Olivia Colman. That's exciting.
I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, I was going to say, an option is always She's also written the acclaimed nonfiction works 9 Parts of Desire and Foreign Correspondence. Brooks started out as a reporter in her hometown, Sydney, and went on to cover conflicts as a Wall Street Journal correspondent in Bosnia, Somalia, and the Middle East. She lives in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, with her sons, her horse, Valentine, and screaming hot wings, and a dog named Bear. And her most recent novel, the one we'll talk about today, is Horse. Jabari is the author of 13 books for children and 8 books for adults. He is a Guggenheim Fellow whose work has been included in Best American Essays and Best American Poetry. Longtime journalist as well. He's the former deputy editor of the Washington Post Book World and editor-in-chief of the NAACP's Crisis magazine. He is a professor at Emerson College, where he directs the MFA program in creative writing. And his most recent works include Yonder, that's what we'll talk about today, and Me and Muhammad Ali, it's a children's book. Well, great to have you both here.
Great to be here.
And so, what I want to do first, I always forget to do this when I moderate events because I'm so excited to talk about the books that I think I forget that, maybe people haven't read the books. So the thing that unites the kind of common theme between your books is you both take these incredible imaginative leaps into the world of enslaved people. And but the books are very different. You kind of get there in different ways. And so I wonder if just very quickly you could give us a kind of elevator synopsis of the book itself, so we'll have a basis on which to sort of build our conversation. Geraldine, do you want to start?
Sure. I became horse crazy as a middle-aged woman, which I don't recommend. It's not a great time to start to learn to ride, but I did. And as a result, when this affliction seizes you, you don't want to think about anything but your horse. And this was having a bad effect on the book I was supposed to be writing. But then I happened to be at a lunch and heard about how the skeleton of the greatest racehorse of the 19th century had been languishing in the Smithsonian, had just been restored to glory at the National Museum of the Horse. And I thought, fantastic, I can write a novel about a racehorse. And I had no idea until I started doing the research that it couldn't just be a story about a racehorse, that it would have to be a story about race, because it turned out that the success of this horse was built on the plundered labor of enslaved and formerly enslaved black horsemen whose skills and expertise had created what was in the 19th century a national obsession. You can't imagine how popular horse racing was, seeing what it's dwindled to today, but everybody was invested in in these great thoroughbred match races. And so it's a pretty fraught thing for a white woman to be trying to imagine these black lives of the past, but I thought, I can't just center this book on the white owners. That would just be erasing the contribution of these men, and they were all men, of course, in that era, erasing their contribution again. So I'm going to just have to do the work and do the research and try and do my best to resurface the story of what they did. And so that's the historical spine of the book. It went off in a couple of unexpected directions. It's also about the science at the Smithsonian in the present day, and about a missing painting of this horse and another painting of the horse of mysterious provenance that bring you right to New York 100 years after the horse's day into the 1950s and the birth of the abstract expressionist movement. I didn't think I'd be going there either, but that's where the story took me.
Jabari?
Let's see. I actually scribbled down the first few notes about Yonder back in 2008. My practice, I guess, is it's as deliberate and strategic as any writer's, I think, but it's also intuitive. And I was walking down the street in Champaign, Illinois, and the sentence came to me, all of us have two tongues. And I had a little notebook in my back pocket, and I stopped and I wrote it down. And that actually remains the opening line in the book. But what happens up in Yonder takes place in 1852, and it's an exploration of the love lives of a group of enslaved people, not just their romantic and sexual lives, but their friendships, their relationships between women, kinships, that sort of thing. And the question I wanted to explore was, how does one love in impossible circumstances? And it's very much a continuation of the other fiction I've done, which can all be, I think, considered a romance in some form. I'm always interested in relationships. And so I set out to just kind of look at this one question. What if you loved someone and that someone loved you back, but laws and custom made it impossible for you to choose each other? What are the ways in which you could respond to that particular conundrum? And so Yonder sets out to investigate that question.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious for both of you if there was any kind of inhibition, and Geraldine started to talk about this a little bit, about writing this particular world. That if the questions of who is allowed or who can tell this story, and how much respect you have to bring to telling the story of these people. In your book, there's a lot of sex. You're looking at their erotic lives. Is there any moment where you thought, is there something a little sort of sacrilege about projecting myself back to the lives of these people and doing that? And for Geraldine, maybe to expand a bit on the those questions of, did you feel yourself inhibited? Like, how do I have right is a strong word, but am I going to be, is it going to seem legitimate for me to sort of enter into the minds of people who are so different from me? You can start.
Well, it's an act of imagination, right?
Right.
So I'm willing to take that chance and also acknowledge the possibility that I may do it poorly, right? I'm just going to do it to the best of my ability and let the readers decide. So, there are multiple narrators in Yonder. Some of them are men, some of them are women. And there have been readers who've kept scorecards. Women speak this many times.
Oh, boy.
Men speak this many times. And I have had some women say that they were somewhat challenged by the scenes in which the women characters were sexually aggressive, where they initiated the relationship. And I just kind of gently push back and say, if you desire this person and this person desired you, but you could be sold tomorrow, you might act on that impulse today, right? Circumstances are different. And so I was willing to take that leap. You raised the question of respect. I think that's a really good word.
Yeah.
I did try to be really respectful of these stories and these histories, but ultimately I'm acknowledging that there's a risk involved, right? And I'm just going to do the best I can, and readers will let me know.
Respect can be inhibiting for a novelist, right?
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
It will close certain doors that you want to go down.
And you don't want to do that. I'd rather err on the other side. I don't want to err on the side of caution. I want to go too far personally, and have the reader say, you could have. You could have stopped that a little earlier. And sometimes you get that, right? But then there are other people who say, I'm really glad you did that, right? I'm really glad you showed that. So,
Geraldine?
Yeah, I think, I was really moved and inspired by something that Marlon James wrote. I think it was an angry rant on Facebook, actually, but he was critiquing a book about times of enslavement, and he said, I don't want to read another word on this subject that is only about immiseration, because the story of slavery is immiseration and oppression, but it is also resilience and love and talent and people who took their dire circumstances in their two hands and created lives within this brutal system. And that's what Jabari has done in Yonder, is look at the love. And I've looked at the resilience and the expertise and how people managed to find some agency in a system that tried to deny them any agency. And I rested very heavily on two things: the work of real-life historians who have studied, the details of slave marriage, for example, and the economics and all those things. So I tried to do the work in that respect, but also I realized pretty soon that if I was going to have a contemporary story running alongside the historical spine of the novel, I couldn't leave race out of the contemporary story, because that would be like saying, oh, well, all this is over and done with in the 19th century, emancipation and, Obama, and we're post-racial, and isn't that great? We all know that's a big lie. So I knew I was going to have to let the theme of race and injustice reverberate in the contemporary story as well. And then you're really in deep shit. But there I just rested on the incredible generosity and patience of Black friends. And, there's nothing more tiresome, I think, for Black people to be explaining racism, their own racism, to white people. But luckily, my friends were generous and read multiple drafts and commented and helped me a great deal. And, living on Martha's Vineyard, which I have done for 20 years now, I'm really lucky because there's such a vibrant Black community there. And one thing I've learned from that community is no amount of education, no amount of wealth and prestige and fame is going to protect you if you have a certain color skin. And I think I've heard stories from all my friends that just make my hair stand on end, and I think everybody in this room probably remembers the story of how Skip Gates was hauled off his own porch in handcuffs for the crime of trying to open his own front door. So, that was what I was drawing on.
Mm-hmm. I was glad you used the word agency, Geraldine, because that was something that I thought about a lot when I was reading both of your books, that it seems to me you're returning a bit of agency to these, to the stories of enslaved people, and finding these sort of spaces in their lives. And in Geraldine's book, positions that people might have had that actually gave them, in the case of some of the characters that you write about, a certain amount of, it's hard to use the word power, but they were in charge of a sport that was incredibly important, and they were critical figures in it. So, but I wondered also, can we talk about agency when we talk about enslaved people, when we talk about the institution of slavery? Like, did you wrestle with that idea as you were building these characters?
Well, I was looking for ways in which to show that agency, because if you read the nonfiction stories from enslaved people, resistance can be something as simple as just breaking your tools, right? So there's always this pushback. But I was looking specifically in a couple of spaces where this resistance could take place, and one was language, right? I really wanted to do a lot of, I wanted to have the language reflect the perspectives of the enslaved much more so than of the enslavers. So that was really important to me. The other thing was the spiritual practices of the enslaved. I really wanted to look at ways in which, we talk about decolonizing our syllabi, decolonizing our reading lists, our curricula. And so I was kind of fascinated with this idea of decolonizing our spirits, right? Our spiritual practices. What would that look like for people actively pushing back against the spiritual practices that were being imposed upon them, right? So it actually was, I don't know if fun was the right word, but it was very diverting to be able to engage in that and imagine what that might look like.
It was fun to read. Well, tell us a little bit about the 7 words, because I thought that was, so this was something that you invented, right? I mean, there's no record of people. No, and this was kind of a spiritual practice that you gave to your characters. Yes. Imagining sort of what an organic kind of form of, religion almost, or
Yeah,
ritual
sure,
that they would
sure.
have amongst themselves?
Sure. Among a certain population of the characters in the book, when a child is born, 7 elders gather and each whispers one word in that child's ear. And the child grows up knowing those 7 words, and they become sort of a mantra or a prayer. You say it in the morning, you say it at night, you say it whenever you're in a moment of turmoil or challenge. And so this whispering ceremony becomes a very important ritual for the people, as are the 7 words. And so if you're enduring misfortune, and one character might say to another, well, have you said your 7 today? Right? And just sort of remind you to stay in touch spiritually. And I was intrigued many years ago when I was in college. I read about this movement in Chicago of black writers that was called Nomo. And Nomo is an African word which means the power of the word to affect material change. And I was always just kind of, wow, and so that was always in the back of my head. And I was looking for a way to expand upon that and elaborate on it. And that's where the concept comes from. But the 7 words came out of here.
Yeah. That was great. No, I mean, in both books, there's just such new ways of sort of looking at this time period, at the institution of slavery. And I think that you were doing it, I imagined you were doing it for yourself as novelists, sort of finding new ways into this story, but it also gives the reader, I think, a new perspective. So I'm thinking, Geraldine, in your book, just choosing a character like Jarrett, who has this very unique vantage point on slavery, and I remember there's one scene that really stayed with me of when he's sent to work in the fields, which he's never experienced before, right? Because he's always had this, his father had protected him, and then he had a set of skills that, kind of put him in a certain position. And his own sort of, we kind of see it through his eyes, which I wondered sort of if you were looking for these sort of purposeful ways of allowing us to see in a fresh way, sort of what that experience might have been like.
You get so wrapped up in believing in your characters, and the idea of Jarrett came to me from horsemanship, because knowing horses, I know that it's not the owner or the trainer or the jockey that matters to the horse, it's the groom. It's the groom whose footsteps the horse responds to and whinnies when they hear them, because it's the groom who's feeding and brushing and caring for the hurts and spending the time and even sleeping in the stalls and delivering the foals. The grooms are there all the time, and they have the close relationship. So I was looking at that character, and there is this wonderfully described but hasn't been seen for over 150 years painting by an artist who is also a character in the book, Thomas J. Scott, and it is titled Lexington Being Led Out by Black Jarrett, his groom. And I would so love to see that painting. But this was the horse in late age, and so then I went into the records to look for Jarrett, and I could only find him in brief glimpses, like in the payment records of the farm after emancipation. The owner started paying people and noting down that. But I thought I could catch glimpses of him in letters when it said Lexington will be brought from Natchez to New Orleans by the darky groom. And I thought, that's got to be Jarrett. And so I started to see this guy everywhere. And now I've forgotten what your question was.
No, that's actually, it leads me to another question, which is how do you do this sort of historical fiction where there's such a dearth of material? Actually, there's not a lot, right? That's in the voices clearly of the people that you're writing about. I mean, there's not. You made a decision, Geraldine. The one character who speaks in first person is Scott, right? The painter.
The painter. That's because he was a journalist as well as a painter, and so there's a lot of writing by him on the record. And there also happens to be a really wonderful Civil War memoir in which his speech patterns are recounted and his sort of clever trickstery nature is revealed. And so his was a voice I could hear very clearly speaking in his own words, whereas with the others, no. Yeah.
But like Jabari, you made the decision to do all the voices in first person, and so how did you even begin to imagine what they would speak or think like? You know, because that's where like the historian sort of stops and the novelist has to take over. But it's not. It doesn't come from. You're not inventing it out of thin air. Like I imagine that you were sort of trying to build on what might have, how they might have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I immerse myself in narratives, right? And the narratives themselves are complex, right?
Yeah.
Because who are the formerly enslaved recalling their experiences to, right? And so the Works Progress Administration archives is full of those, and one of my ancestors is in there, and so I was kind of using my imagination to fill in certain gaps, right? So, for example, my family has a Facebook group, and it's named after the oldest known couple in our family, and their names are Sam and Iris Harris. So we can go back to, like 1870 or something like that, because the census before that, black people aren't named. They don't have names in the census, so you have these hurdles you have to overcome. But one of the questions I always had was, well, who begat, if you will, Sam and Iris, right? Who are the couples that made them so that they could become a couple? And I don't have access to that information. So as a novelist, I'm almost sort of getting revenge, right? Because I get to create these narratives and kind of imagine these people as ancestors. But, something Geraldine said made me think of something that Toni Morrison said. She said, at some point you stop the research because you want to give your imagination room to invent. Room to roam. And I was indebted to one book in particular called Forbidden Fruit by Betty Doremus, which was one of the early nonfiction studies of romantic relationships among the enslaved.
Right.
It's those Works Progress interviews are invaluable, but they're also, as you said, problematic because most of the interlocutors are white, and so how frank can the interviewees be? And there's only one that I was able to find actual oral history with one of the great trainers, and it's fascinating and it's revealing up to a point, but he's talking to the daughter of his former enslaver, so he's obviously going to be pulling a lot of punches. Right. So you have to just, bear all that in mind.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that oral history collection. It's like, it's such a paradox that it's the last, the only thing that we have, and yet it's so compromised in many ways.
Right, and so like, my ancestor that's interviewed in there was a small child at emancipation, and so my older sister was born in 1950. That ancestor was still alive, right? So my parents drove to Mississippi so that my sister could be blessed by that particular ancestor, who's in the Works Progress interviews, and there's a line in there that haunts me. At the end of the interview with her, the interviewer says, "She is a high yellow darky who likes to be looked up to." And
this is the interviewer says.
So that's actually in the archive, right? There's this sort of narrative imposition, even after she's kind of opened up and told her story of being enslaved. So it's always there.
One of the things I thought about as I was reading your books is just the challenge of, producing a piece of art that covers ground that, in some ways, there has been representations of slavery of this period in many films and in books, not as many as there could be, but they are, and there's even cliches already, right? I mean, there's certain sort of images or characters who are sort of come to, I mean, I know this a little bit from the world of like Holocaust, memoirs and books where, there's always certain scenes that feel like, you see them repeating and you, but how do you sort of write against the grain of that? How do you make sure that you don't fall into the trap of, writing something, or maybe it's not a trap, but you want to sort of offer a new perspective, and yet there's so many of these cliches that already exist. I don't know if...
there is a lot out there, but I guess I decided to try to do this when an African-American novelist wrote an essay in which he said, let's not do this anymore.
Oh, okay.
Let's not do any more novels because essentially they've been written,
Yeah.
you know. And the minute I read something that says don't do it, I just want to do it, right? So I was like, oh, I gotta do it now, right? Because he's so wrong, right? So, but I mean, there are a million different ways to portray this experience, and we haven't gotten close to many of them. But I did set out, I did want to do it differently, right? I wanted to play with the idea that there are conflicting narratives from the beginning, where one character says, this is what happened, and another character says, this is what happened. And there are characters in the novel who aren't black. They never narrate anything.
Right.
There's not a single scene in which they get to impose their version of events on what happened. So I wanted to, that's another thing I was sort of not wrestling with, joyfully engaging, I would say, as I wrote it.
Was the critic you were responding to saying there shouldn't be books like this anymore because it's been done, or because like there is such horror at the heart of this thing that representation, because this is what people did say about the Holocaust at some point too.
Yes.
There's such horror in the actuality of it that words cannot even come close to describing it, and we shouldn't try, because the act of trying to tell that story is somehow particularizing it, debasing it in a way that doesn't capture the horror of it.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that, but my response is, then what am I here for?
Yeah.
Right, as a writer. I mean, that's why I'm alive, is to honor the experiences of my ancestors and to render the facts and muscle of their existence as faithfully as I can, right? So I didn't hesitate in that regard at all, because I was like, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
So these are among the stories that I should be telling, right? That's why I have particular talents, such as they are, right, is to do something with them.
Right.
I actually could have less interest in talking about my ancestors because they were a miserable bunch of people. So for me, when people say, you have to stay in your lane and just write the story that you're born into, that seems a very, very arid place to me, because, look, I'm sure they had many redeeming characteristics, but my ancestors were Irish Catholics of a very bigoted strain who hated women and hated Protestants and lived very constrained lives, and I don't want to write about them.
We won't make you.
Fair enough.
Another sort of funny, I was reading these books thinking about, like, where are the landmines? Just like, it's interesting to think about how amazingly you both sort of navigated what could be difficult territory, in the fiction that you're producing. And one of the things I thought about was sort of finding the balance between, letting the issues of the moment of the day, of right now, kind of infuse your thinking about the past, and inform it, and sort of ignite your own motivations to write, about institutional racism, but yet not also falling into the trap of what could be called presentism, of seeing, because that could be pretty deadly for historical fiction, right? Of seeing everything through a contemporary lens. And I know, Geraldine, there is actually contemporary sections, and I think you mean for them to sort of rhyme in some way, or to have a conversation with one another.
Resonate, anyway.
Yeah.
And I think, it's it was partly because the noise around me was so loud when I was writing the book, because I started writing this book in 2016, and we all know what else happened in 2016. The Great Orange Menace took over the White House, and it was like a jackhammer outside the window every single day, and you would wake up and say, what's he done now? And, Black Lives Matter, and so many murders and so many deaths, and it was a very noisy time to be writing on this subject, and so obviously it reverberates all the way through the novel.
But did you worry at all that it would sort of shape how you wrote about the past?
No, not at all, because I think, for me, I found that the lives of these expert black horsemen so surprising. And I found, the way they moved through their times. I learned so many things. These were guys who had certain abilities that were denied to most enslaved people, like they could travel. They were bringing these horses across the country from state to state. They could acquire some property in their own name, which was something that wasn't even supposed to happen under the laws of the time, and yet they did, and many of them managed to purchase their own emancipation, which was an extraordinary achievement through their skills. And so, that was fascinating to me. And the one oral history has something in it that was so astonishing that I didn't include it in the book because I thought it, Mark Twain says fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. But there's a limit to how much truth you can inflict in a novel. The story is of this trainer, Charles, who was one of the greatest trainers of the time, an enslaved man who was permitted by his owner to buy his own wife. And so he has his wife, and then she displeases him, and he sells her and the 2 children they had together. And I thought, if there's anything that shows you the brutality of this system, it's that it could lead a man to do that.
Yeah. Jabari, was presentism a worry for you at all?
Not especially. I mean, I'm writing in that same context that Geraldine has described, but I tried very much not to think about that. But, I wanted to stay in the world of the characters, and for the most part, I was able to do that.
Tell me about the use of the thieves and the stolen for those of you who haven't read the book. That takes the place of talking about slaves and masters, right?
Right.
It seems like obviously it was a very deliberate choice, and it sort of scrambles you. It throws you into it throws off the reality of the realism of it a bit, but also puts you at an interesting distance, because it sort of reshapes your thinking. But I'm curious about that.
Well,
that choice.
For people who haven't read it, people whom we normally describe as enslaved are describe themselves as stolen, and they describe their captors as thieves. So whenever they're addressing their situation, they are in fact making a moral judgment, which is what I wanted them to do. But on one level, I really wanted it to operate as a philosophical novel because I'm sensitive about certain things. These are characters who think deeply about their situation, their circumstances, the role of human beings in the cosmos and what the cosmos looks like. And what that speculation is up against is the fact that very few of them have ever left the boundaries of their captivity. They actually don't know what's on the other side of the fence. So they speculate a lot. And I wanted the language to reflect that. But one of the inescapable facts of their circumstances is that they were stolen, that they are in a place being held against their will by other people who stole them. Right. So it stands to reason that they might regard them as thieves. And the thing that I was sensitive about was when black artists often ponder these same questions that I described, it's folklore. When white thinkers explore these same things, it's philosophy. Right? and so I wanted to create characters who were living in what we might call a folkloric circumstance, but were engaging in pretty sophisticated philosophy. Right. And so the language had to reflect that.
And you set it up in the sense that you talk about a language that is theirs and a language that others might hear.
2 tongues.
And so that might be the way they talk and think about themselves.
Right, and that's still certainly the case among black people living in this time and space. Right, most of us have 2 tongues. We have to. It's a matter of necessity.
Right. I'm going to actually turn to some audience questions in a minute. I'll ask one more question, but start thinking if you have something that you want to ask. and if you have a loud voice, since I don't think we have a microphone out there. But I guess my last question, and this is maybe like selfishly as somebody who writes nonfiction and who, who's kind of tries to do history with a storytelling bent, where do you think fiction can do things or find historical truths that history or nonfiction can't? Like, you talked about the moment where you kind of have to let the research down and let your mind. So I want to understand sort of the benefit that you see to understanding a historical truth. You're not just beyond the storytelling, but what are you allowed to understand about history because you turn that other switch on?
So I started out as a journalist and did that for more than a decade, and it was often frustrating to me, having reported out a story as far as I could. I often knew things, but I couldn't prove them with two sources, and so I couldn't write it. And then when I turned to fiction, I realized I could follow the line of fact as far as it led. And then when it ran out, but I thought I had an instinct for what might have happened, I could keep going. And in journalism, they took a very dim view of that. Or they used to, anyway. So for me, it's by all means, and I really enjoy the thrill of the chase, like, let me run this down until the voices fall silent, until the record is blank, and then make the imaginative leap. But by the time you get to that point, generally, you've got an idea of at least how it might have been.
Yeah.
Well, like Geraldine, I have a background in journalism and often ran up against some of those same constraints. But I really got deeply into fiction. I had been researching the same book for 7 years, a book that is called The N-Word, and it's basically a biography or a cultural history of that racial slur. And I found myself immersed daily in just, really hateful, sick material, and it began to affect me, right? And so, I would have to put it down, and I wanted some escape. I wanted some refuge, and that became fiction, right? I said, I'm going to actually get away from these ugly facts. And so my first collection of stories actually began to be composed while I was working on that other book, almost as, an analgesic, right? It's just like, oh. And so fiction still kind of performs that same function for me, because I still write nonfiction. It's just it's a different part of my brain. It allows something to release. It's like a giant exhale.
I just wish everybody would read The N-Word. I just think it's an astonishing piece of scholarship. And no, I mean, it is a refutation to all the nonsense that is going on about critical race theory and how our kids can't face up to being taught this history. They have to know this history.
Any questions from the audience? Oh, come on. They weren't going to let me give you a chance to ask questions, and I said, yes, please, and now there's no questions?
Don't be shy.
Yes. If for those who didn't hear, she asked about your baby book. Yeah.
Yes, sure. So the question is, where are the baby books coming from, I guess, that I'm right. Well, I'm father 5. My children are all grown now, but originally the baby books came out of nonsensical rhymes that I would say to my children. A lot of the early picture books as a way of entertaining them, to get them to do certain things, like take a bath or go to bed or anything like that. And I did a reading of my baby books, really early, and I said, my daughter inspired this book. She's in the audience, and she was very little, but she wouldn't let me point her out. She's like, don't do that. So my daughter's grown now. She's in the audience here today, but I'm not going to point her out.
Any other questions?
Up the back?
Yes, I see one all the way back there. You're just going to have to be a little bit loud so that we can hear you.
I, I would never have the arrogance to tell any reader what they should or should not get from my book. To me, it's just a privilege to be read, and everybody comes to the book and finds what they find. And I think even if you reread a book, you find something different because you're different when you read it. So I promise you there are no white saviors in it. Only you can tell me if I did the work. Only you can tell me if it was worth it. Really, I was very influenced by what one of my black friends said to me, which is, your work is to talk to white people in a way that they won't listen to a black person. And so I kind of feel like, I know and I love my core readership, and they tend to be white women of around my own age. And I hope through this book I've shown them maybe another way or two to look at the situation. And so if I have any sense of mission, I think that's my mission. But I would be honored if you would read it. And if I didn't do the work, I hope you will let me know.
Geraldine, did you worry about that? Was that white savior problem something that you thought about?
It didn't really come up in this story because the guys didn't need any white saviors. They were doing quite a good job of saving themselves. And unfortunately, I won't go there, no spoilers, but some people aren't saved.
Yes, yeah. I mean, in fact, I'm remembering a scene where the white woman is Mary Carr, is that her name? The one who she gets a character in trouble because she doesn't understand. Like she's the opposite of a savior. She actually is quite dangerous.
She's a blockhead.
Yeah. Well, you said it. Other questions out there? Sorry. Yes.
So the question is about the research and yes, I do a great deal of it. And the question is, what have I turned my attention to now? I actually just finished a book which is just it's really an extended essay of literary criticism, and it's for an Australian series where one writer assesses the work of another Australian writer. So that's a kind of totally separate thing, and that was a project that I could do between submitting this manuscript and the book coming out. And the next thing I'm going to do is a very introspective piece of work, very different, nonfiction, and it's not something that is very research-driven. But after that, my next historical novel in this is inspired by a piece of furniture, and it is going to be it's going to span. It's got a very long time span, so I'm going to be researching it for quite a while.
Do you enjoy that phase of the work?
I don't usually do the research separate from the writing, so I just do enough research to get started, and then I let the story tell me what I need to know, because I think there's a huge danger in front-loading the research, and then you get something that's so fascinating. I mean, my favorite example of this, not to pick on any one writer, but I was reading quite a good novel, and obviously the writer had gone to a lot of trouble to learn this one specific thing. And you get to this point in the novel and somebody tunes a piano, and one character says, "It must be great to know how to tune a piano. How do you tune a piano?" And then you get 20 pages on how to tune a piano. So I'm always trying to avoid the piano tuning syndrome.
to sort of have to learn it and then forget it, and then be able to.
Well, you know, I get enough to start, and then I write until I need to know something, and then I go and find it out.
Did you have that experience too, Jabari? Like, would you write about? Would you get to a point in the world that you were writing, and you were like, I need to know what people ate, or what what a day would have looked like work-wise, or like, were you sent back into the research?
Yeah, I mean, sure. On the front end, I accumulated what I thought was enough to get started.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But eventually, you run into something, and you go,
Right.
Well, what might they be doing in this scene?
Right.
'Cause, in playwriting, they call it the business. You want to give the characters some business,
Right.
So I would have this dialogue, and the dialogue would be clear to me, but I would be like, but what are they doing?
Right.
Right. And then I would go back and figure out something so I could put them in a place and give them an activity.
Okay, well, thank you both for doing this.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.